Me.
really what I wanted to do next. And an opportunity came up to be the guest rabbi in Milan for several months, and that was wonderful. And then when we got back to Hartford, a pastor from Germany, a Lutheran pastor, was on sabbatical studying at the Hartford Seminary, and she used to come to Torah study at the congregation where I was rabbi emeritus. And one of the congregants saw she had a lot of questions and they told her, speak to Rabbi Fuchs. Vickie, you might want to tell about how Ursula got involved.
With us going to Germany, you mean?
Yeah.
So she spoke to Steve and she wanted him to come to Germany. Wasn't sure how. While we were in Milan, Steve said, "Oh, why don't you come see us sometime?" And she said, "When?" And we established a date for her to come. She stayed with us in our apartment. She spent 97% of her time talking to Stephen and about 3% talking to me. But the 3% talking to me, she figured out a way to get Stephen to come to Germany, which was through my mother's experiences, having had to leave Breslau and go then to Barcelona and leave Barcelona and go to an orphanage. And her adventures, I suppose you could call them, were a way to get both of us to come to Germany because she worked with a high school teacher who wanted to teach his students about what life was like for people who were leaving. And they set up a whole program about my mother and her journey.
Oh.
Because she had to leave Barcelona after 6 months. They left in 1936. And of course, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and then they had to leave Spain, and she was in an orphanage for a while. And so the students were fascinated with my mother's life, but that was also a way to get the school system. There was no separation of church and state, so the school was able to pay for our airfare, I believe, to come to Germany. And she had our bodies in Germany. We taught in the school, but then she was able to have Stephen speak in quite a number of different churches, in some synagogues. There was a synagogue in Bad Segeberg that he was working with there. And so she sort of set up, through my mother's life experiences, a way to get Steve to come to Germany and speak to colleges, high schools, elementary schools, and I spoke with them also.
But back to Kristallnacht, I would say I had never heard of Kristallnacht. I did not know what it was until I had graduated college and enrolled in the Hebrew College as a rabbinical student. And at the opening convocation, the late dean and then subsequently president of HUC, Alfred Gottschalk, Rabbi Gottschalk, spoke about the experience that he, as an 8-year-old child, had in Oberwesel, Germany, where he was born, watching his grandfather wade into the frigid waters of the Rhine to rescue scraps of Torah scrolls that had been thrown into the Nile, by the Nazi soldiers on Kristallnacht. And I didn't even know what Kristallnacht was, and I thought, oh, that was terrible. A few months later, my father, of blessed memory, became quite ill, so I flew home from Los Angeles to New Jersey, and I was picked up at the airport, taken right to the hospital, and to my shock, my father did not recognize me, but he was babbling in German, which he never, ever spoke at home, because my mother was an American woman and my dad just spoke English and never spoke about anything. And my uncle, my dad's brother, was there. And I said, what is he talking about? And my uncle said he's asking the guards to stop beating him. And that's how I knew for the first time that my father had been arrested on Kristallnacht. And so that really was the beginning of my interest. In 1982, fast forward, I was able to make my first trip to Leipzig, Germany, where my father grew up and where he was arrested. And at that time, it was part of East Germany. And so the train stopped at the East German border, and the guard came on, asked me and everybody else what we were doing, and I did not have a visa for East Germany. And what do you want to go to East Germany? Why do you want to go to Leipzig? I said, oh, I'm a rabbi and my father grew up there. And as I was telling this story, I could see the face of the guard change. And it became very hard. And I said, uh-oh. And then he said, wait here. 5 minutes later, he comes back. You cannot go. You must go to Berlin, which was like 5-hour train ride in the other direction, and ask for a visa. And I had no choice. I was trying to convince him. We got nowhere. So when I finally get to Berlin and I get to the border guard, why do you want a visa to go to Leipzig? Oh, I said, I'm an art teacher and I want to see Leipzig's famous art museums. And lickety split, I had a visa to go to Leipzig. And that was the first time I went to the city where my father grew up. And I wanted to go immediately to the zoo because the reading I had done was that the Jewish men, there were 500 Jewish men arrested on Kristallnacht, of the 10,000 across Germany, were taken to the zoo, made to stand in a stream that flows through the zoo where Nazi soldiers had commanded villagers and townspeople to gather around, spit, throw mud, and even, forgive me, urinate on the Jewish men standing in that stream. And I just needed to see it. And it, of course, brought tears to my eyes. The next day, I started looking for the Jewish communal office, which was very hard to find, around, about, alleys, and a narrow staircase. I finally encountered the chair of the community, and I said, well, how many Jews live in Leipzig today? And he said 67. And I said, well, at the height of the population, how many Jews were there? Oh, in 1935, 18,000 Jews lived in Leipzig. And how many of those 18,000 were killed in the Shoah? 14,000. And that hit me, of course, as you can imagine, between the eyes, how fortunate my father was to be one of those who, because he had relatives in the United States who had petitioned to Senator Herbert Lehman of New York, and there were still diplomatic relations between Germany and the United States in the weeks after Kristallnacht, and they got him out. And he came to the United States, made a beautiful American woman, married, and my sister and I were born. And so that began this obsession. So when we came back to Germany, this was a very important agenda item, obviously. And I can only compare and contrast the difference between my visit to Leipzig in 1982, where I literally had to sneak into the city under false identity, if you will, to being welcomed back in 2014 to speak at 3 different Kristallnacht commemorations on the evening of November 9th. This was 2014. And at that time, of course, there were now not 67, not 14,000, but some 1,200 Jewish people living in Leipzig, mostly expatriates from the former Soviet Union.
Wow.
That's, in as brief a way as I can express it, how I became, I would say, consumed with Kristallnacht and doing the kind of reconciliation work, because it was a German Christian pastor who had arranged all of the speaking that I did in churches, all of the teaching, which Vickie and I did together in schools, the work I did in synagogues, and of course, I also had the privilege of conducting seminar at the Abraham Geiger Rabbinical College in Potsdam at that time, and at the Berlin Center as well.
Wow. So first of all, to those who are here, I do want to mention that the chat function is working, and if you have questions for Rabbi Fuchs or Vickie, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them on, as we go. So one of the things that I'm curious about is how, first of all, how it felt to be speaking in some of these places, but also how Germans who were hearing you and speaking with you across generations were engaging with their past. And when you and I had spoken a couple of weeks ago, I had mentioned that in Hungary, the government seems to be working very hard to minimize their role in the deportation of Jews, that they were Nazi victims too, and that they weren't really complicit. And I did send you a couple of pictures of the memorial I mentioned with the barbed wire. How do they feel about reckoning with their past?
That's an important question. And generally, I would say there is an eagerness to hear us, to be engaged with us. And I think there is a lot of generational guilt.
In Germany, he's speaking of Germany now, not of Hungary.
And so we really stressed at every stop, you are not responsible for that. My mantra was, we cannot undo the past, but the future is ours to shape. But a word about Budapest, because when I was with the World Union, I was invited to Budapest, met with the non-Orthodox congregations there, saw the changing of the guard, and was offered a guided tour, private guided tour of the city by a professional licensed guide. And the guide said to me, is there anything in particular you want to see? You can have this, you can see that. And I said, the one thing I really want to see is the memorial to Hannah Senesh, whom some of you know was the young lady who was raised in an assimilated Jewish family in Budapest, did not, to her parents' chagrin, want to continue her education at university, but wanted to go to what was then Palestine to help reclaim the land. She listed it as a volunteer in a kibbutz where she signed on and engaged in the work of draining swamps and all of that kind of thing. When the Shoah broke out, she was parachuted behind enemy lines and was giving comfort and aid to the partisans who were resisting the Nazis. She was caught, she was tortured, she was executed at the age of 23, and she's left us a wonderful legacy of her poems, which many of you may be familiar with, that have been set to music as well. And so I knew there was a memorial to Hannah Senesh, and I thought, wow, in Budapest, that's great. That's where I'd like to go. Well, this professional guide had absolutely no idea where such a thing was, and I still can see him getting on his phone and calling the office and speaking in Hungarian. This bozo wants to go to this memorial. I've never heard of it. Where can I find it? And there were a couple of back and forth. And finally, he took me to a park in some obscure, nondescript part of town. And there was this tiny little rock with an inscription on it to the memory of Hannah Senesh. And that's very disappointing. I understand now there is a second memorial to her, more centrally located. But this just corroborates what you were saying, Rabbi, about the seemingly lack of accountability that Hungary seemed to want to assume for what happened. But back, if I can switch to Germany, it was very interesting because the title of my book is "And Often the First Jew." The title comes about because I remember being invited to a small village in Schleswig-Holstein and a church on a Sunday morning with a cornerstone that said 1220 on it. And the sexton or the shamus or whatever Lutherans call that person in their churches, coming up to me, "Rabbi, we are very pleased to welcome you, but you should know that you are the first Jew that our parishioners have ever seen." And I found that to be the case in many of the some 24 plus communities where I spoke in churches on Sunday mornings over the 5 years that we spent significant time in Germany. But there is one church above all that I can never, ever forget, and that is the church in the village of Kaltenkirchen. Kaltenkirchen has a concentration camp, a stone's throw, which was not a death camp, but a labor camp. And right across the street, there are these very stately homes of wealthy Germans who, as Vickie and I have discussed many times, had to know what was going on. But the thing that was most striking about this church was that their former pastor, a man by the name of Ernst Bieberstein, had left the church after rising to a position in the hierarchy to become a Nazi Oberkommando who, in the Nuremberg trials, was convicted of the atrocity death of between 2,000 and 3,000 Jews. And when Pastor Zieg, the pastor Vickie mentioned, who arranged all of our, said, "We want you to go to this church and speak there," I said, "You got to be kidding. Who would, that's beyond the pale." And no, they're very eager, and the pastor there, who was an absolute delight, is most eager for you to come. And the Fuchs, which is sort of like the underbishop of the area, will be there to do the translation. I spoke in English, and I would have either Pastor Zieg or somebody else standing next to me translating as I go along. He himself wants to do the translation as a symbol of the significance of the occasion. And I refer to the church as the Church of the Broken Cross because one of the parishioners had painted to symbolize the chagrin and shame that these people felt that they had a pastor who actually was first their spiritual guide and leader, who then did what he did. There was a picture of a cross uprooted from the ground, lying on its side, and that hung in the vestibule or the social hall of the church. Wow. And so the feelings of remorse, of guilt, were palpable. And you could literally feel it in the air. And it was turned out, in my feeling, to be a very sacred moment, if you will. And this pastor was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, sentenced to die, but somehow the church commuted his sentence, or had his sentence commuted to life in prison. And then, they got him released. And he lived out his life, and he died at a normal age. I mean, I think something like 85. Of course, he wasn't involved in the church anymore, but they still carried these feelings of shame about what this man had done. And so to speak there really felt like we're reaching out across the generations. And my message, as I said before, was there is nothing we can do about what happened. The future, though, is ours. And then addressing the ghost, if you will, of the pastor, I said, "You are rotting in hell, but we Jews are still here. And we and your former church parishioners will go forward to shape the future together. And I think it was a very well-received message, and it felt especially powerful to us to be there.
It did. There were tears in some of the eyes. They needed to hear that they of our generation and younger generations were not the responsible ones. I would mention that Lieberstein was convicted of contributing to the murders of over 2,000 Jews. I would also mention that that particular concentration camp was fairly open. It had mostly political prisoners and very few Jews. And there were beautiful houses across the street. And apparently there was one woman who kept needing repairs on her house. And she kept asking for people to come from the concentration camp to do repairs on her house. And she would feed them, and she would give them extra food to give to some of the other people who were incarcerated there. So as much as there was evil, there were some kindnesses, and that was a specific one to that concentration. I would also mention that, you spoke about Hungary. Poland is not accepting responsibility for what they've done either. And they are saying we are victims of the Nazis and the Jews were killed because of the Nazis. But we all know that they were very complicit in killing 3 million Jews that had lived in Poland.
Yes. And I haven't actually read Dara Horn's book, The World Loves Dead Jews, but I did hear her speak about it. And it really gave me a different perspective about all of these Jewish heritage trips and Jewish heritage sites. And oh, yes, we had, and even I saw this when we did a cruise on the Danube this summer. And when we were touring various places, and this is where the Jewish community was or is. And, but you didn't want us when we were here. And now all of a sudden you're talking about the Jewish community like it was some wonderful relationship. And that's one of the things, that we do have to grapple with. Vickie, I'm curious about your experience. Your mother's family left before everything started, if I remember correctly.
Mother's family left in 1936. Her father, who was a physician, and his father, who was also a physician, both fought for the German army in World War I. They were both doctors for the German army in World War I. But in 1936, he was told that because he was a Jew, he could no longer practice in Germany. So he took his family to Spain, where he thought that they would be safe. And he set up a practice. He was a radiologist. He brought all his x-ray equipment with him to Spain and set up a practice. And the Spanish Civil War broke out. And my mother remembers being 14 years old and seeing soldiers outside and standing by the window and having the soldiers say, "Get away from the window, get away from the window."
Wow.
But they had to leave because if you were not a citizen of Spain, you had to leave. And so my mother's mother went to Lyon, France to become a translator, German and French, for a professor in Lyon at the university. My mother's brother was in school already in Switzerland because he was very gifted in math. And my mother went to a children's home. I would always call it an orphanage. And she kept saying, "It's not an orphanage. It's a children's home, a Kinderheim." Well, there were children there with no parents. So to me, it was an orphanage, but she objected to that very strenuously. She went there to work at age 14, 15. And she sewed the blackout curtains. She scrubbed pots and pans. She had to iron. She had to wash. She was washing. You can see my hands here. She had to wash the clothes like this until somebody discovered that her blisters had become infected. Blisters on all her fingers from washing the clothes. And then she was assigned to ironing. And she did all kinds of work, and she did calisthenics for the students. But my mother was also a very gifted artist, even at that age. And the children put on a play And
Mhm.
my mother painted the backdrop for the entire stage. And when the children put on the play, there was apparently some big shot woman who said, "Who painted that?" And when they said it was my mother, this big shot person said, "She doesn't belong here. She belongs in an art school." And they paid for her to go to Zurich, to live in a pension, and to take art classes at age 16,
Wow.
which was incredible. Um, at one point, I would mention while she was at the Kinderheim, of course, she was away from her parents at a very young age. And the Kinderheim arranged for her to see her mother in a very unusual way. There was a child that had to be brought to the train station. So they had my 15-year-old mother take the child to the train station. My grandmother then took the train from Lyon to Zurich to meet with my mother for a very brief period, maybe an hour or two. And my grandmother then went back to Lyon, and my mother went back to the Kinderheim. But she still got to see her mother for a couple of hours. Eventually, in 1938, my grandfather was able to, I'm not sure exactly when he came to America, but he came to America and was able to send for my mother and my grandmother, and they came aboard ship in 1938, in the summer of 1938,
Wow.
to New York. And I'll give you another little piece of very nice information. There was a very handsome young man, several years her senior, who was also on the ship, who had some connection to my grandmother. He knew somebody, I don't know, and met my mother and fell in love with her. 6 years later, they got married. There are a lot of details in between,
Yeah.
but kind of romantic that my parents did meet on the boat when my mother was 17 and my father was 23. He had no business dancing with her, in my opinion, but it all worked out.
It certainly did work out for the best. Thank you. So to get back to the reason that we're here, Kristallnacht, what parallels do you see between what was happening then, what's happening now, and a question of, guilt and responsibility?
I think because of what happened then, we Jews are understandably on hyper alert, and we should be. That said, I believe the differences between now and then are greater than the similarities, speaking personally. You know, look, even when I was president of a worldwide Jewish organization, I did not presume to speak for the Jews. Nobody does. I speak for myself. I think that, yes, there is rising anti Semitism. Yes, it is scary. And yes, I'm certainly not deaf to the many who say this is like Germany in 1936 or 35 or 37 or 30, whatever. I don't see that. I think that I believe this will pass. And I think we Jews now are in have much greater access and much greater power than we did then. And I also think we are more alert to the possibilities of what could happen.
So the times that you've spent in Germany, and I know you were in Germany recently, because you posted it on Facebook, so we knew. What parallels do you see between Europe and the United States, or how are other areas in Europe reckoning with a world that is very polarized, where there is a lot of fear of the other, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever.
I think there is fear. I think that what happened since October 7th, 2023, has been taken and manipulated by those who hate Jews and hate Israel to drum up fear and loathing of Jews among people who really don't understand or choose not to understand certain realities about Israel and about Jews in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is something we should be concerned about. But when I look at social media, it is not all Jew bashing. Jews are standing up in very strong and articulate and powerful ways,
Mm-hmm.
responding. And that word is getting out too. Yes, there are anti-Semites. Yes, there are those who will look at the underdog, if you will, and see the Palestinians as this oppressed people. But I think the message is also being countered strongly and effectively by many different voices from many parts of the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community. And so if you ask me personally, I don't see a catastrophe looming, but I do see the need for us to be on alert and to be articulate and willing to stand up as proud Zionists, meaning people who believe that we Jews, just like more than 20 other Arab nation states, we have a right to a Jewish state that will always be there as a refuge and has given and continues to give so much to the world. And we have to continue to send that message out there. And it's tiring at some point, at times. It certainly is, because you find yourself saying the same things over and over again. But I think it is important, and it is the work that this time and this place calls for. And I would rather be in a position of having the strength that the Jewish community, both in the United States and around the world, has than in the weakened situation where we were in Europe in the 30s when all of this happened. I remember several years ago on one of my visits to Israel, meeting with an Israeli general who said to our group, and it was a very small group because it was in the midst of the Intifada, look, we all dream of the day when, as the prophet proclaimed, the lion will lie down with the lamb. But until that day comes, I'm glad we have the strength of the lion.
Amen. For sure. So Leonard Lehman has been waiting patiently. Leonard, would you please share, you wrote on the question of guilt versus responsibility, the quote that you heard Elie Wiesel tell a group of German students in Berlin in 1986, and then I'd like to hear Rabbi Fuchs's response.
Shalom, Rabbi. I was in Germany during some of the period that you were there. I was in 1979. I went to German-speaking Europe for a period of 7 years and worked in various theaters, including Theater des Westens, where I was the first Jew to conduct Fiddler on the Roof, and founded the Jewish Music Theater, Jüdische Musiktheaterverein, which performed on both sides of the wall. Elie Wiesel spoke to a group of German students in the spring of 1986 in Berlin. And I'll never forget what he said, because it touches on the question of guilt versus responsibility that you have been addressing. He said that he first came back to Berlin after the war in 1964, and he couldn't bear it. He thought on every street corner there might be somebody that had killed his parents. I mean, he left very quickly. But he came back in 1986, addressing a new generation, and he said, "Your generation must not feel guilt about what happened. You have to feel responsibility, because." And he said, if you think about what your parents and grandparents did to my generation, and you don't think you have a problem, then you must really have a problem. That's the way he put it. And they took that to heart and,
Thank you.
And responded to him. We collected testimonies of evidences of anti-Semitism in Germany, Austria, Switzerland since the war. Made a cantata out of it called Jewish Voices in Germany. Performed it in Berlin, Dresden, and Roskilde. And I want to stress about Germany, unlike, as you've mentioned, Poland and particularly Austria, where they still say we were the victims. In Germany, in German, there's a word: coming to terms with and mastering the past. And young Germans in my generation, ever since 1979, when the Holocaust series on television, which didn't make a tremendous impact here, made a tremendous impact in Germany. And the kids started asking their parents and grandparents about it in school. We want to learn about it, and we want to be memorable about Germany. That's one reason I think that Merkel welcomed the immigration, even though it cost her politically tremendously. She welcomed immigrants into Germany, as in more than in any other country.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to hear Rabbi Fuchs's thoughts, responses.
I think it is absolutely true. They should not feel guilty, but they should feel responsible. And my feeling, and I think Vickie's as well, as we spoke in schools and in churches, there is a feeling of responsibility. There is feelings of sorrow. There are feelings of remorse. And I think my job and our job was to remind them of the distinction between guilt for the past, which they were not part of, and responsibility for the future, which they most certainly do have. As one example of guilt for the past, Vickie, I think if you would share the story of the young man who told you about his grandfather.
There was a very sweet young man with very pink cheeks. He was about 6'8", and I had to look way, way up at him after we had finished speaking to his class. And he looked at me and he was crying. And he said, "I have to apologize to you." I said, "Why do you have to apologize to me?" He said, "My grandfather was SS." And I said, you know, their imaginations and our imaginations go wild. If they were SS, what did they do? What did my grandfather do? He's not going to tell this child about all the people he murdered or tortured, but the child has it in his brain that his grandfather did something to Jews. And I said to him, "You don't have to feel guilty. You didn't do anything. Your grandfather did, but that's not your responsibility what he did. Your responsibility is to help keep it from happening in the future." There were also older adults. We spoke in a church in Stephen spoke in a church in Bad Segeberg, and a military officer came up to me and apologized for his father, who had been a soldier in Breslau, where my mother was. And he felt guilt that maybe his father had harmed one of my relatives. It felt personal to them to meet people whose parents had gone through this. And it happened in different cities. Stephen spoke in a church in Bad Segeberg also, and there was an exhibit about my mother's life. And a very old woman, not so much older now, she was 85. This was 10 years ago. I was in my 60s, and 80 looked very distant and old. And she didn't speak English, and my German is not good. But when she saw the pictures of my mother's life and she read about my mother's life, it opened a freedom in her. And it opened freedom in other people that, yes, it is now okay to talk about it.
Mm.
She was telling me that as a child, there was another, she was 5, and there was another child who was 5, a Jewish boy, and she saw him get taken away. And while the adults may have said, oh, we didn't do anything, she was there with her hands like this. I know, I saw what they did. I saw them taken. I know we are guilty. And she, at 85, had been carrying this in her heart for 80 years.
Wow.
But never talk about it. So I felt like we opened up some floodgates in some of the people. There was a younger woman there who told me that when her father left for war, he played the guitar, he sang, he was happy. Afterwards, he came back and he just wanted to sit on the couch and do nothing. We don't know what she didn't know what he saw, she didn't know what he did. And it gave me a little bit of compassion towards the Germans. I still shudder when I hear German spoken. Even though we were in German and treated kindly, I still quench because I think also, what did your grandparents do?
Mm.
Some of the things I've told the children, in the high schools, when we ride on a train nowadays, I look out the window, I see that there's a toilet we can use. I said, when you look out the window, you just see trees and you see this and you see that. I said, when I look out the window, I look at the trees and I see the houses of all the people who didn't do anything. I see the trees and I wonder, could I have survived in a forest like that? When I look at the toilet on the train, there's a whole bathroom little area. I think of all the people in the train cars who were packed in and had no toilet. And the kids look at me like, oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
And they're also now allowed to talk about it. And I think talking about it is very important because they can get off of their hearts what they're thinking about.
I think for us, we felt very privileged that we had the opportunity to repeat Vickie's word, a bit of impact. That said, we're not deluding ourselves. We have not cured cancer. We have not made peace in the Middle East. We have had the privilege of influencing a few people in a few schools, in a few churches, well, more than a few. But yes, sometimes it feels like what we're doing is analogous to taking a teaspoon and trying to drain the water out of the ocean because there is such a backlog of history and hate and all of these things. And it's so clear to me that this is not just a responsibility of us, but of each of us. I think that our greatest ability to ensure that it does not happen again is to continue to be speaking about it, to continue to be articulate about it, to confront those who speak about the genocide that the Jews, quote unquote, are committing in the Middle East. All the time we hear it. It's no fun. You don't want to spend your days and nights arguing, but I think this is what today's reality calls on each of us to do. We can't hide and pretend that it doesn't affect us because it does. And all of those hostages that suffered so horrifically, we know they could have been our brothers, our sisters, our children. And so they are our responsibility. And I think that if we were able to ignite feelings of responsibility, not guilt, as you were saying before, sir, in today's generation, then, we've done something. And I don't think any of us gets to do everything we hope we want to do in life or in any particular situation. But knowing that we're moving the needle just a little bit is gratifying, to be sure.
And in many respects, I see parallels with Germans today reckoning with their past, and feeling a sense of guilt or responsibility for their ancestors and slavery in the United States. And I can remember being in Charleston, South Carolina a few years ago and visiting the synagogue, beautiful synagogue in Charleston that was built by slaves owned by Jews. And while I would like to believe that the Jewish slave owners were nicer to their slaves than perhaps non-Jewish ones were, the reality is that we know that people are people and not everyone behaves in a humane way. We don't share the guilt, but we do have to work to reckon with the past. And in Charleston, they're doing a lot of work to to preserve the history and to show this is not okay. This is what happened, but when we, having just being a month and a half away from the high holidays, when we recite the 13 attributes of God, extending kindness to the 1000th generation, but not forgiving, or extending, not forgiving even until the third or fourth. And that part doesn't actually make it into our pleas on Yom Kippur, but in the Torah verse, it talks about the iniquity of the parents being visited upon the children, even 3 generations after. But what our rabbis remind us is that the only time that happens is if the future generations don't do teshuvah and change their ways. So just because your grandfather was a Nazi or your grandfather was an SS officer, as long as you're not following in his footsteps and doing terrible things, that is not your guilt. If you, on the other hand, have been raised to, and Mark Lennon, who says, as a professor at a Pennsylvania State University, another major area of concern is the continued stereotypes of Jews, even so-called positive ones. If you've raised your child or your grandchild to buy into these stereotypes and to be anti-Jewish, then perhaps we're not so quick to forgive because you haven't learned from it. So those are a couple of things that come to mind for me.
I think the idea of teshuvah is what inspires me personally to eagerly embrace the opportunity to be in Germany, because as a nation, it is mind-boggling. I mean, you go to Israel and you see all of the German buses, the Mercedes buses, the taxis, all of the reparations that have been paid and the different gestures. And somebody said, only semi-tongue-in-cheek, there's almost a Holocaust memorial on every street corner, because they want to remember and they want to realize what can happen when these kinds of things gather momentum. Momentum is a very powerful force in athletics, as we all know, but in the human psyche as well. When a certain idea gets rolling, it becomes like a snowball going down a hill, very hard to stop, and it gets stronger and more powerful and more difficult to counteract. And the efforts to which the German nation and the people are going to not only remember the Holocaust, but to actively atone for it is something that, frankly, I found very inspiring.
And we can all use with a little more teshuvah in our lives. So, hang on a second. Let me just check my
I mean,
questions. So how have you seen the commemoration of Kristallnacht change over the years? Has it changed?
Well, let me start with what I began with. There were no Kristallnacht commemorations when I was growing up. And as I say, I was a reasonably alert and somewhat intelligent 22-year-old kid studying to be a rabbi, and I never heard of it. So the fact that there are Kristallnacht commemorations is very important. And I think the fact that the non-Jewish community has taken responsibility. I had the privilege in 2019 of being the keynote speaker at the Catholic Jewish sponsored Kristallnacht commemoration in Naples, Florida, and there must have been 800 people there.
Wow.
And so the fact that this is something that resonates with people and gets people to think about how the human spirit can be corrupted and turned in ways that lead down dark and evil paths, I think is very, very important. And so just the sheer number of these ceremonies that are held in various cities across the country and around the world. When we were in Germany, it was a great thrill to be able to contrast the image of my father cold and shivering in the stream with people throwing dirt on him and speaking in the Thomaskirche, the huge cathedral in Leipzig where Johann Sebastian Bach was the choir master for the last 20 years of his life until 1753 or 1751 or whatever it was, with a full church, not necessarily to hear me, but to hear the boys' choir there that is world famous, and to be able to present this message of we cannot undo the past, but the future is ours to shape. It's got to feel like progress. And I think, again, going back to the image of momentum, we need to keep that progress moving forward. And that's why I was always happy. I know that when one year we were in Flensburg near the Danish-German border in a Catholic church. And now Flensburg doesn't have a lot of Jews. And the fact that we were there and invited to speak at a Kristallnacht commemoration for the benefit of the citizens of the German, almost Danish city of Flensburg, it's mind-boggling because they care. And that's so meaningful to both of us.
I would just mention we both spoke there. We both spoke in German. Neither one of us speaks much German, but we translated our speeches. There was a children's choir singing, all blonde-haired and blue-eyed children. But it was a huge church, and it was a huge organ, and the organist played Jerusalem of Gold.
Mm.
And I nearly broke down when I heard that. It was unbelievable, the power in this organ, the sound of the organ playing Jerusalem of Gold for this commemoration. I'll remember that always. I would also just mention, we felt very safe there.
Mm-hmm.
When we spoke to large groups, Ursula Sieg, who was the pastor, made sure that there was undercover police protection always.
Oh.
And people interviewed us and him for different newspapers. She made it very clear that we were never to be in a photograph together, and they were never to take a full face picture. They could only put his picture or my picture in from the side for our protection.
Wow.
Oh, boy.
Which blew me away because, as wonderful as all these things are that we're talking about, it's not perfect. There are, anti-Jews and different populations, but we were protected. But those were two specific things that
Yeah,
with me that
sure.
would protect us. And he
Yep.
was in the newspaper a lot in the different cities that he went to.
And I didn't make it into any of the newspapers on our cruise, but before we went, that was a concern of mine. What are we going to find when we get there? What are the people going to be like? Am I going to feel comfortable traveling in Europe as a Jew? And, once we got there, of course, everything was fine. And the cruise started on Friday. It was Tuesday before another Jew outed themselves, but we did manage to find each other. So I just want to mention for those who came in late, if you have any questions, let's keep the political stuff out of this. But if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. And my final question is, given your experiences there, what is your advice, recommendation? Where do we go from here? As Jews, as a society, as individuals, how can the lessons of Kristallnacht be instrumental in moving forward?
I would encourage every Jew to be public and proud. I think that is crucial. I remember several years ago when we used to have confirmation class sessions with parents, and one of the parents, who unfortunately passed away at a very young age, but he left in my mind this story that when he was in the Army, one Friday afternoon in basic training, his drill sergeant came up to him and said, "Soldier, I've got good news for you. I've arranged for you to be able to have time off to attend services at the local synagogue." And the gentleman said, "Well, thank you very much, sir, but I'm not really very religious, and I don't usually go to services." And he never forgot, and he shared with the class, and I never forgot what that drill sergeant said. "Son, if you're not going to be proud of your religion, don't ever expect anyone else to respect it." And I believe that with all of my heart. I think to the extent that we Jews are publicly proud of who we are, what we believe, not arrogantly, we're not better than anybody else, but we are part of a tiny people that has made disproportionate to our numbers contributions to the betterment of humanity. And we need, especially at times like this, to stand up, be visible, and be counted as proud and public members of the Jewish people.
Amen.
Amen. So, all right, let's get past the political stuff. So Leonard was wondering if the choir sang Yerushalayim Shel Zahav or if it was just the organ that played it.
They sang it.
You sang it. Wow. That's amazing.
In what language?
In Hebrew.
In Hebrew?
The children sang, and there was an adult choir too.
I remember hearing Hebrew.
I just remember
Okay.
the
All right.
children sang some short songs in Hebrew also.
Did anybody sing the Shir?
Jewish children.
Did they sing the Shir LaShalom?
Sing what?
Shir LaShalom.
I don't think
They
so.
didn't sing Shir LaShalom.
No.
There is a German translation of that. They should sing that.
Thank you for letting us know.
Good to know.
So Mark is saying, as a Catholic Gen Xer, I first learned about Kristallnacht, not in school, but from the 1979 miniseries Holocaust. Around the same time, the whole country watched Roots and faced the truth about slavery. Today, I worry that shows like these wouldn't even be made and that many of my students have never encountered this history at all. And this hits close to home. My wife is Chinese, and she was blamed for COVID by people who knew nothing about her. That's how ignorance grows when history isn't taught. In a culture of short attention spans, guilty, and fading memory, what can we as educators do to make sure this history isn't lost to the next generation?
Teach it.
Powerful question.
Sorry for the long post, Rabbi.
It's okay. It's okay. You can take a moment here. It's okay.
I have, throughout my career, been willing to serve in adjunct roles at colleges and universities to teach courses about Judaism, even when a prudent analysis of my schedule and my time would have led me to say no, because I prioritize the importance of doing what I can to educate the general public about things Jewish and being available. My book, Often the First Jew, is a title that I chose, and it comes from a place of pride, because I felt that, okay, if I'm the first Jew that you've seen, let your impression of what Jews are be of what you find. And I felt that that was a burden and a responsibility and a privilege that I would remain very proud to take on, because, my goodness, that is what I think we need today to be able to explain. One of the peak experiences for me of the years, it was between 5 and 6 years over a period of 5 and 10 weeks each year for 5 different years that we were in Germany. Not a short time. One of the peak experiences when I was invited to lecture a class of Muslim and Christian religious education students at the University of Hamburg on the Book of Psalms. And the professor said, "Look, I saw your itinerary. You took a train 3 hours out of your way to come to Hamburg to do this. Why? What?"
Sure.
I said, "Because I think it's important.
Exactly.
I think it's absolutely vital. And for me to take a 3-hour detour in order to get in front of 60 Muslim and Christian students who are going to be teaching kids about religious subjects, it's worth it." I mean, there's no remuneration involved.
Yeah.
It's just something that is, I believe, something that I wanted to be able to do, and I was pleased that I could do it. Like I said earlier, we don't delude ourselves. We weren't curing cancer. We weren't making peace in the Middle East. But if each of us does what we can in this realm, in whatever way we can, even in one-on-one conversations with people who make offhanded remarks about how we're slaughtering all of the people in Gaza and committing war crimes, then I think we're doing what we should do. And I urge each of us to do whatever we can in whatever way we can.
Thank you, Rabbi. You just gave me some idea for my next syllabus. And you made another sale. I just bought your next book. So I really would encourage you to do more audiobooks. When I listen to you, I feel like I'm listening to my granddad.
Oh,
Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Then my work here is done. I also want to say that, kind of a plug, but, it's important. Another one of Rabbi Fuchs's books is called What's in It for Me? Finding Ourselves in the Biblical Text. And I think about this a lot because the Torah, our main characters in the Torah, the people, Abraham, our patriarchs, and Moses and all of these people, I call them Stan Lee superheroes. They're humans who've been endowed with a little bit of something extra, but they're fallible. They do things that would not get them prophet status in Islam or sainthood in Christianity. But in order for our ancient text to be relevant, we have to see ourselves in that text. And how do we identify with those individuals? And the same thing coming to more modern times, that we can perhaps identify not only with the victims, perhaps, of the Holocaust and other atrocities, and not just against the Jews, but also the perpetrators, because none of us are perfect. And we all have a past that we need to reckon with. And that's really important. And Mark, thank you for your sensitivity to this and for your desire to want to educate the next generation and make sure that they understand where we've come from. We live in a time of cancel culture where it seems very easy to just wipe out the past as opposed to struggling with it. We had a situation here a few years ago. We have a street in Malvern that was named Lindner Place after a man named Paul Lindner, who built a lot of Malvern and had a lot of money. But it turns out that he was also a big mucky muck in the KKK on Long Island, was responsible for burning a couple of orphanages, and was also a recruiter. And here we have a elementary school with a decent sized minority population, and a group of middle schoolers got together with the NAACP and the village board to have the name of the street changed. And the name of the street was changed to Acorn Way because Malvern's slogan is Acorns from Oaks. But rather than just change the name and wipe out this person's positive contributions, there is a plaque explaining it, and the old street sign hangs in the school district's office as a reminder of how far we've come. So these are all the things that we have to think about and reckon with. And I'm guessing all of us here are old enough to be mentoring the next generation, whether it's our kids or others. But we have to reckon with our past. And Rabbi Vickie, it has been amazing to have you with us. I feel very blessed that 6 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever, Rabbi Adra shared the podcast about my book, and you reached out and said, I want to contribute. And I thought, oh my goodness, this guy is like huge in the Jewish world. And then learning about your work in Germany and your passion is really amazing. And I thank you. I don't know if anybody very briefly, Leonard, that was, I want to say 3 years ago, maybe in January. I'll have to check. So
Thank you.
does anybody, a quick question, because I want to be mindful of everybody's time. It's, it's like Sarasota midnight, as my father would have said, All right. So thank you for the thoughtful comments in the chat. Any closing thoughts?
Any closing thoughts, my love?
It's wonderful to see some of you that I haven't seen for many years. And Donnie, I would mention that Don Marino is one of Steve's oldest friends. We don't get to see him very often, but it's a real privilege to get to see you tonight.
Absolutely.
And Cindy, haven't seen you in 100 years, and really wonderful to see you. And I'd like to thank all of you for wanting to participate in it. And I feel a great privilege to be able to speak to all of you and learn from all of you. And thank you.
I just have one final question. Vickie, have you written books too? I want to read you.
One of
Vickie has essays in this book. She's got her own section.
I'll contact you later, Rabbi. You'll send me a reading list. I'm
There you
sincere about
go.
that. Thank you,
There you
Carl.
go. So,
They-
Mark, how did you hear about us all the way in Pittsburgh?
Rabbi, I was going to call him Dr. Cross. I'm now, Rabbi Fuchs, I'm going to read your dissertation. I was listening, Tennessee, was it? University of Tennessee. I don't know how one more meets people on social media, but Rabbi Fuchs has been a connection for years now. I've very much enjoyed, reading his books. More recently, I'm recovering from a lengthy surgery and I've been listening to his audiobook and I find it very inspiring. And I was just delighted that I'd have the opportunity to come to today's event. And thank you for hosting. And thank you, everyone, for showing up because, quite frankly, as a professor, this says to me, yes, there are people who do remember, and there are people who want to avoid this in the future. So thank you all for your very thoughtful questions as well.
Well, and
and
thank you.
Kyle Kochi, for arranging for this meeting. Thank you.
And I'd like
And
to
I-
thank the audience too that I
Last question, Rabbi Fuchs, do you happen to be related to Rabbi Nancy Fuchs,
The answer is
who
no.
married my
I hope that somebody
brother?
asks her as often as people have asked me if she's related. Well, so no, I'm not. But I admire her work.
Okay, thank you.
And George posted all the way from Australia that he is the president of the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants. And I want to make a plug for another book. On my Yom Kippur Sermon, I talked about a lot of the books that I'd been finding in Jewish author groups online. And one of them is called The Star on the Grave. George, have you read it?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't.
Okay, the author is Linda Margolin Royal. And her
Yeah, I know. I've met her.
Okay, so her
And I
family
know
was
about it. I
okay.
haven't got around to reading it.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
It is about an Australian family who identify as Catholic. The
Yeah.
main character is about to get married to a Greek Orthodox man. And when the grandmother walks into the church to talk about the wedding, she has a very visceral reaction. And basically, the family was saved by the Japanese consul Shiune Sugihara.
Sugihara, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
we actually had we have instituted an annual lecture honoring the Swedish
yes, whose name is escaping me. It was at the
yeah,
top, J, began with a J.
no, anyway,
Yeah,
it'll come back. But yeah, and she was Wallenberg,
right.
the Wallenberg,
Yeah.
Raoul Wallenberg, and she was the first guest speaker for that sort of oration.
Okay. Well, I definitely highly recommend the book. It's, it's historical fiction, but it's her family's story. And
Yeah.
the fact that you're in Australia reminded me of that. I seem to have encountered a lot of Holocaust books, but they were all uplifting. They were all personal stories. So that was really important. Melbourneian Jewish poet Alex Skovron.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So other than that, I want to thank everybody for being here. The magic of Zoom, we can be here together from all over the place, and its technology is a gift. Thank you all. And if any of you would like to be on the Malvern Jewish Center's mailing list, just shoot an email, malvernjewishcenter@gmail.com. We'll be happy to put you on the list for future programs and classes. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Rabbi
Thank
Vickie,
you.
Right,
thank
thank
you
you.
very, very much.
Good night.
Be well and Shabbat Shalom a couple days early.
Couple days.